Welcome back to the BlackTrack, where I do commentary and review on movies with an all-black cast, or at least a black lead. Thanks for coming back and joining me for part 2 of the Jacksons and American Dream. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, make sure you go and check that one out first. When we last left off, the Jacksons had just signed with Motown and were well on their way to superstardom. The drama in the Jacksons and American Dream was definitely front-loaded, with most of its storytelling and exposition taking place in part 1. And part 2 feeling like it was a little bit rushed and padded out with music. In more than one occasion, we get the entire song, whereas in part 1, you might hear one verse and a chorus here or there. And with part 2 being 30 minutes shorter than part 1, there isn't much room left for character building. I guess it's a good thing then that we got to know all the important people in part 1. Despite the flaws of the second half, does that mean that it ruins all of the goodwill set up in the first half? Let's BlackTrack and find out. When part 2 picks up, we're already knee-deep in Jackson mania, and you already know the best way to cover a bunch of cinematic ground when you're short on time. That's right, you guessed it, a musical montage. The movie shows the Jackson 5 touring all over the country and just how rabid the fans are to get their hands on just a little piece of the Jackson boys. I can't even call them all groupies because a substantial amount of the people trying to grab on them are men. Wait, can men be groupies too? I never thought about it before. Hell, a large portion of Beyonce's fans are men too, so I guess they can. I admire the movie for even attempting to detail and condense their careers into just a couple of minutes, because from 1969 till around 1974, the Jackson 5 were everywhere. It's hard to even really explain just how big the Jackson 5 were, so I know it would have been impossible to put it to screen. The movie shows none of this, but Berry Gordy and Motown Records were determined to make the Jackson 5 into a universally recognized brand, and as a result, they had their own trademark logo that said J5, an animated TV show, were featured on magazines usually reserved for older acts, had several sold-out shows where they had to turn people away at the door, some even attended by as many as 20,000 people. There were lunch boxes, coloring books, board games, you name it, and that's just scratching the surface. If you need more evidence as to just how big the Jackson 5 were, then consider the fact that Ike and Tina Turner used to open for them, not the other way around. It wouldn't have been impossible to show all of this in the movie, but it would have been a little bit of a waste of time. So the movie chooses instead to focus on the human element and how the lifestyle affects the boys while they're on the road. I like it. It says a lot by showing a little. Like how Tito is in love with a girl named Dee Dee, who he talks to every chance he gets and ends up eventually marrying in the movie and in real life. Since Michael and Marlon are the youngest, they spend all their time playing practical jokes. Then there's Jermaine, and Jermaine Jackson doesn't understand why they have to run from the groupies. Let's hear some of these girls out, especially this one.
I just want to touch you, that's all I want. I just think you're the sexiest guy in the world.
Wait a second, wasn't this dude madly in love with the boss's daughter at the end of part 1? Why was he, a producer of the film, chosen for this one scene with a female fan? Is Jermaine Jackson trying to imply that he was the only brother doing the Jackson 5 slide into some female fans? You can really tell that this was edited to be one whole movie and then later artificially cut into 2 for TV, because in the aforementioned scene with the groupie girl, Jermaine is played by Jermaine Jackson Jr., but the next time we see him, he's played by Colin Steele, and we're only 15 minutes into part 2 of the movie. One thing I like about the Jacksons and American Dream as a whole is that every single family member gets a story, no matter how small, and it's more or less equal. In part 1, Jackie had his issues with wanting freedom as a teen, Rebe helped their mother around the house and got married, Marlon overcame his awkwardness and became a better dancer, and Tito proved he could be a great guitar player. That's just in part 1. In part 2, Jermaine has a far bigger story with he and Hazel Gordy's relationship. LaToya gets a small story despite not wanting to participate in the making of the movie, and even Randy gets a small story later. And of course, Michael is all over this thing. The only family member who surprisingly doesn't get much attention is Janet. They only briefly bring up the fact that she performed in Vegas as a child, was a part of the family's short-lived variety show, and was on the TV show Good Times. She barely exists in this movie. Of course, this movie is really primarily about Joe and Catherine, and the best scenes are with them, easily. In most scenes, Joe is being an anus as usual, but in part 2, Catherine is older, wiser, and stronger, and has a little more backbone when it comes to Joe's bullshit. Joe has this weird mindset where he doesn't want any of the boys to get married or leave Havenhurst. So when Tito announces he's getting married, Joe's whole demeanor is like, shit, you can afford it, what you telling me for? Catherine has kinda had enough at this point. What really pushes her over the edge is the night that one of the kids leave towels in the pool, and Joe is just looking for somebody, anybody to beat. It's comical, because it's just like he just has to get it out of his system.
Michael! Molly!
I've had enough, Joseph!
But Catherine finally puts her good foot down and puts it into it once and for all, in a hell of a scene.
All these years I've had enough. You cannot do it anymore. What are you going to do? Ask him to go out, get a switch off a tree, bring it in here so you can beat him with it. Go to bed, Joseph. Go to bed.
Well, I guess that's the end of that then. Is that all it took? The movie ties that bow so tight. I wish all abuse could end that easily. It's bad enough that Joe done lost Tito and Reby to marriage, but now Jermaine not only talking about getting married, but getting married to the boss's daughter. As I mentioned earlier, the new actor for Jermaine is Colin Steele, and he's okay. It just sounds like he's having an asthma attack or something when he talks.
I love Hazel. She's the only one I love.
Just let me get through this scene. And speaking of strange casting, it feels like the people who was in charge of the casting for the film never actually saw the real people, because Monica Allison, who plays Hazel Gordy, looks nothing like the real life Hazel Gordy. And she's not the only one, but I bring her up specifically because it feels like they only picked her because she has hazel eyes. Get it? Hazel Gordy? Hazel eyes? It's like they took the name Hazel literally and thought, well, obviously, Barry named her that because her eyes are hazel, but I assure you, they aren't. And he didn't. Because part 2 is substantially shorter than part 1, we get these massive time jumps that weirdly skips over the majority of their Motown career. Essentially the height of their entire career. The movie skips around from about 1970 all the way to 1976, and I could see how someone who was a massive fan and lived through their career might be put off by a huge part of the story being cut out. But I'm a little more understanding about it. First, I think the creators made a conscious decision to focus on the stories more than the musical career. And second, they probably wanted to make sure they dedicated enough time to the life-altering event of the Jackson 5 leaving Motown and going to Epic Records, since that was kind of a huge deal in real life. Joe is fed up, not only with the lack of input he has in his son's career, but also with the fact that Motown isn't exactly knocking the door down to produce more hits. So he works out a deal with CBS/Epic to have the Jackson 5 go there under a new contract. There's just one problem. This puts Jermaine in a hell of a position where he has to choose between his wife and father-in-law and his brothers. He chooses Hazel and Barry Gordy, which is the right choice by the way, and that ends the long-standing original makeup of the Jackson 5 as we know it. It was way more to their departure from Motown than the movie presents, and there's really only one reason why the movie would gloss over the finer details like that. Lawsuit. See, in reality, the Jackson 5 were still under contract with Motown when they negotiated that Epic deal, so of course, Motown sued for breach of contract. Not only that, Motown owned all the rights and licenses to the Jackson 5, meaning they couldn't take anything with them, including the name. But come on, like Joe Jackson gives a damn about that. As smooth as ice, he just changes the group's name to simply The Jacksons and slides Randy right in the place of Jermaine, like nothing ever happened. Movie Randy got to be the luckiest guy in the group. You get slotted in damn near into your adulthood and miss out on all the boot camp abuse that the rest of the brothers had to endure. You lucky bastard. I highly doubt real life Randy was so lucky. No way in hell he was just ready to step in no problem without at minimum a two-piece, and I'm not talking about a suit. Now you would think that a large portion of this second half would be centered on Michael Jackson, but it's not as much as you think. Considering most of this half of the movie takes place after the release of the Off the Wall album and during the recording of Thriller, shockingly, none of that is really mentioned, and we only really see a small clip of Michael recording Human Nature. I think what we get instead is better though. We see stuff like Michael lamenting the fact that his acne and skin conditions are getting worse, and his close relationship with his mother. Personally, I think these scenes showed a side that you otherwise wouldn't see from such a polarizing celebrity and attempted to try to humanize Michael. It's still some weirdness included, because it is still Michael Jackson after all, So there's a bunch of wild and exotic animals wandering around Havenhurst. This is one of the funniest parts of the movie to me. Not because there's anything comical being said, but I just like watching the actors try to stay calm next to these animals that will eat their face off at any moment. I like how they were smart enough to put the lion in a cage where no other animal is locked up. And it's clearly somebody just off camera whose job it is to reel the lion in. Get your ass over here. Look how Angela Bassett keeps turning her head. She's ready to go flojo on that ass at any moment. You can even see a hand in the scene at one point holding a chain. The shoddy editing tells me that the actors made it very clear that they were only going to do this take one time, so you better make that work. And if you think all these animals were just a weird inclusion for the movie, then you'd be wrong, because each and every one was personally delivered from the real Michael Jackson's own collection to add some authenticity to the movie. Speaking of Michael, it would be disrespectful of me if I didn't address the elephant in the room. No need to adjust your eyes. Yes, the guy who plays older Michael Jackson looks strikingly similar to the real Michael Jackson from that time period. I remember back when this movie premiered, and before the internet, people would spread rumors claiming that this was Michael's actual secret son from Billie Jean, and we didn't know any better or have a way to look it up, so we just believed it, mainly because he looked so damn much like him. In reality, Michael is played by Wally Draper, a dancer who had already been doing small gigs as a Michael Jackson impersonator and who had already appeared in the Remember the Time music video. He may not have had any acting experience, but in my opinion, I don't think there was anybody alive who could have played Michael Jackson as well as Wally Draper did. Hell, look no further than the fact that nobody else has even come close since this movie came out, and probably never will. Sadly, Wally Draper passed away just 1 year after this movie premiered from a rare form of leukemia. At least he got the chance to be immortalized in the role of a lifetime. Now, up until this point, we've been led to believe that movie Joe Jackson was kind of a stand-up guy. Child abuse aside, he wasn't abusive to Catherine, and he did right by her by getting married and not only providing for 11 children, but guiding each and every one into superstardom. But fame has a way of corrupting people sometimes, so I guess it should come as no shock that Joe Jackson had another woman on the road, and he takes Catherine for a fool by thinking she wouldn't notice the little phone system he and his little side Jackson had going on. I love Angela Bassett's acting here, and her reluctance to accept the truth. It's a slow build-up that culminates in a memorable scene.
I heard everything. I knew it! I knew it! You're a liar. And you're a cheat. And I don't want you.
You know what's never really brought up? The fact that Angela Bassett has beat up the cinematic counterparts for not one, but two men who are well known for their abuse, Joe Jackson and Ike Turner. I feel like she deserves an Academy Award for that alone. She decides to take some time away from the compound to go hang out with her mother, and Suge Avery convinces her to go back home and reconcile with Joe. Not really for him, but for the sake of the family. I like that it's not a perfect and happy resolution, meant to make the audience feel good. It's obvious that things will never be the same for them, ending with some ominous words from Catherine.
I don't know how I feel anymore.
As usual, reality is often disappointing, and the real Joe Jackson had a nearly 25-year affair with another woman and even had a child outside of his marriage. So yeah, there's a 10th Jackson half-sister named Giovanni, and of course the movie omits this, unsurprisingly. With a father like that, it's no wonder the Jacksons in American Dream kind of throw shade by having Berry Gordy be somewhat of a stand-in father figure to Michael Jackson. Oh, you just know that Michael personally told them to include this as an FU to Joe, but he would never have admitted that. It's nice to see that movie Berry Gordy has a friendly relationship with Mike, despite the departure from his label. It wouldn't have anything to do with the Motown 25th anniversary show that Suzanne DePass is planning, would it? Michael is bucking on the idea of reuniting with his brothers, and hell, I wasn't even aware that they had broken up. I don't remember the movie passing that information along. That's one of the many drawbacks of jumping time periods so much. Eventually, you start to assume that the audience already knows everything about the group. Mike decides he'll do the show, but
I want a solo spot.
Now, I know I criticized the movie earlier for playing entire songs, but this scene gets a pass because Michael Jackson's performance at Motown 25 is so iconic and legendary that it would have probably been a disservice to the movie to leave it off. Plus, it gives Wally Draper a chance to show just how amazing a Michael Jackson clone that he is. Oh hell, let me not say that. Next thing you know, it'll be conspiracy theories saying that Wally Draper actually was a clone. One thing I wished it was handled a little better was Joe Jackson's redemption arc. After all the dastardly things that he did in both parts 1 and 2, I felt like he needed a strong win to show that at the end of the day, he is a good father. Unfortunately, the movie implies that had it not been for Joe setting up a Pepsi deal for all the brothers and getting them on a commercial, then Michael would have never been put in the position to have his hair set on fire by pyro. This was a very real event, but when they say dramatized for TV, they mean it. The real event, though definitely scary and traumatic, was relatively uneventful. And I know that sounds weird to say when someone's head is literally on fire, but the Jacksons in American Dream exaggerates it so drastically by having Michael roll down several flights of stairs. I mean, the real events were bad enough. Did it really require a stuntman on top of the 3rd-degree burns? The only win, and I use that term loosely, that Joe gets is an opportunity to tell a reporter how he feels about the situation.
It's my son in there. My son.
Aw, that's weak. The character of Joe Jackson basically held this movie together. You could have gave him a better send-off than that. Instead, Catherine gets benediction duty and sends us off with kind words to Michael while he's home recovering and reflecting on the family's journey. The movie ends with a performance from the Victory Tour, the first tour with all 6 brothers and the final tour as a group before going their separate ways. I don't think the movie could have ended any better, considering everything we saw leading up to this, with all the family being together. Except Janet, of course. I mean, damn. Everything else is chronologically out of order. Couldn't they have just pretended that Control came out in '84 and gave us one Demita Joe scene? Let's get to the grade. As I said before, most musical biopics take the lazy way out and focus more on the music than the people themselves. We hardly ever get deep dives into their feelings or emotions, and instead they're usually filled with controversial scenes just for the sake of controversy, and is usually something that you already knew happened anyway, just dramatized for the screen. Not the Jacksons in American Dream though. This movie should be the benchmark for creating the perfect blend of music, character building, and storytelling. When making these kind of movies, it's best not to go into it assuming that everybody knows who the people are and everything about them. Build up each character as if they are complete strangers and get the audience invested in them and their story. The Jacksons in American Dream does this almost flawlessly, setting the tone and personality of each character right from the start. Even if you knew absolutely nothing about the Jackson family, which was me in 1992, it's still a heartfelt and entertaining movie. The great music and fantastic set design is just a seasoning on top of an already great story, as it should be. Now, if you're trying to use this for historical accuracy, well, that's where the movie falls short. Dates and locations are changed to fit the narrative, and even though I prefer biopics to be more accurate than not, it's not a deal breaker here. For the most part, the movie gets the important details right and manages to hit most of the major life events. The part of it that I was most impressed with was the story between Joe and Catherine. Lawrence Hilton-Jacobs and Angela Bassett knocked it out of the park. They brought to life 2 people who nobody really cared about before this, and their portrayal in many ways overshadowed the real life people. Now, in fairness, it was a little easier for the Jacksons in American Dream to pull this off because it was over 4 hours long. But that's not to say that an equally as good story can't be told in half the time. It's just sometimes when a story is larger than life, it needs a larger than normal runtime. My grade for the Jacksons in American Dream is an A-. It's very high on a short list of the best musical biopics ever made. And for the first time in a long time, my grade for its historical accuracy is a B. It gets more right than wrong and only changes things to add dramatic effect instead of trying to rewrite history. And that's it for this episode of the BlackTrack. As usual, let me know what you thought about the movie The Jacksons in American Dream in the comments below. And if you liked the video, don't forget to drop a like and a subscribe and tell your friends about my channel. And until next time, I'll holla at you.